I've driven more than 600 funerals, but I never had to pull over and whisper, "I know you're not supposed to knock." It wasn't loud, just impossible to unhear. A single knock from the back of the hearse, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking for the next 40 miles. Would you open the casket? Let me know in the comments, and whatever you do, don't drive in silence. They called me at 6:17 that morning. I remember because I just sat down with my coffee, black and too hot, the kind that stings a little on the first sip. The dispatcher said the regular guy was out sick, and the family had requested a specific window for transport, something about timing with the cemetery crew. I said yes, of course. I always do. Death doesn't wait, and neither do the schedules built around it. I've been doing this too long to ask for details anymore. It was a cold Thursday. The sky the kind of flat gray that doesn't move, doesn't break, doesn't hint at weather so much as impose it, like a lid set over everything. There wasn't rain, but you could feel it waiting just beyond the clouds, patient and heavy, the kind of morning that coats your bones in silence. I drove the van slowly out of the garage, tires gritting softly on the wet asphalt, and turned onto the road that leads out of town. Same route as always, past the same shuttered diner, past the same church with the flickering cross, past the same fields that seem to inhale when no one's watching. The usual hum of the engine, the whine of the radio that never quite gets reception in the hills. It was all there, but it felt thinner somehow, like a recording of sound instead of sound itself. I didn't notice it right away. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, that low drain you get when sleep was too short and too shallow. But it was more than that. Something in the air had changed. Not colder, not heavier, just still, and I mean truly still. The kind of stillness that sits in the chest and doesn't belong to you, the kind that listens. It's hard to explain that kind of quiet unless you've spent years doing this kind of work. The silence around death isn't empty. It's dense. It presses in, waits, judges. You learn to move with it, to respect it, but not to fear it. At least, not usually. That morning, it felt different. I checked the clipboard again at the red light. Name, Leonard M. Wells. Age, 67. Died 3 days prior at County Memorial. Time of pickup, 7:40 a.m. Destination, St. Jude Cemetery, Lot 19D. No family listed. Just a small note at the bottom. Transport requested by hospital administrator. No viewing, no ceremony. I'd seen this before. People who leave quietly, whose names don't echo in anyone's prayers. Sometimes there's a story behind that. Sometimes there's just the slow erosion of connection. Either way, the drive is usually the same. Quiet, uneventful, respectful. But the sky stayed wrong. That's the only word I can use. It wasn't changing. Not even a flicker of brightness behind it. Like the whole sky had been cemented in place. I rolled down the window halfway, hoping maybe some fresh air would cut the fog in my head. But even the wind seemed absent. The trees didn't move. No birds. No buzz of insects. Just the rhythmic sound of tires on road and the mechanical ticking of my turn signal when I passed the empty farm lot near Briar Hill. Then I felt it. Not a jolt, not a thud, but something. A shift. A quiet redistribution of weight in the back. I checked the mirror. Nothing looked out of place. Straps were secure. The casket wasn't moving. But still, something had nudged the air inside the hearse. A pressure change, subtle, almost like the vehicle had breathed. I chalked it up to the road, uneven pavement maybe. I'd been on this stretch dozens of times and knew it well enough to ignore the creaks and pulls. Still, I turned the radio off completely. Silence is better when you're trying to sense something. That's when I noticed the lack of engine noise. It was running, of course. The van was in motion. But the sound of the engine was muffled, distant, like I was hearing it through insulation. Everything became ... indirect, like watching yourself through a pane of glass. I tapped the dashboard, checked the rear view again, shifted in my seat. No alarms, no warnings. Everything was fine, but nothing felt fine. By the time I turned onto the old mill road, the one that cuts through the valley before climbing toward the cemetery, I felt as though I were driving through a painting. The kind where the trees blur into sky and there's no horizon, just the suggestion of space. I started counting utility poles just to give my brain something to do. 1, 2, 3. That's when my hands went cold. Not from temperature, not from nerves, but from recognition. That same bone-deep cold I've felt exactly 3 times in my life. Once when I found a man still breathing in a sealed body bag. Once when a casket lid shifted during loading, and the corpse sat up, a post-mortem reflex, but one that haunts you. And once when I transported a child whose eyes didn't close until the 3rd attempt. This was that kind of cold, familiar and unwelcome. It sat in my palms and traced up to my wrists. I flexed my fingers on the wheel, willing the blood back into them. The cemetery was still 20 minutes away. The sun hadn't broken through, and for some reason, I didn't want to pass the next intersection. My body wanted to turn around, but my job was to keep going. So I did. The facility had that same washed-out beige look that every county morgue seems to share, like they were all designed by someone who had never seen daylight and hated the idea of it. I pulled around to the side entrance, where a single fluorescent bulb flickered above the service door. A clerk I didn't recognize opened it halfway, clipboard already in hand, face unreadable, voice flat as tile. "Leonard Wells," she said without greeting. I nodded. She stepped aside, and I wheeled in the gurney. The hallway leading to the cold room was narrow and too quiet, the linoleum underfoot worn to a waxy sheen. I've never liked hospitals, and I like their basements even less. They hum differently down there, like the air remembers things. The clerk keyed in a code and pushed through the double doors to the holding area. It was colder than usual. Not just the clinical cold of refrigerated storage, but a deeper kind, like the room didn't want to be entered. There were 6 drawers visible, only 3 tagged. She moved to one near the end, tugged the handle with both hands, and it slid out slow. Like the metal didn't want to give him up. I've seen hundreds of bodies, more than I can count. But when I looked at him, something tightened behind my ribs. It wasn't that he looked strange. If anything, he looked too normal, like someone caught mid-thought, not mid-death. His hands were folded neatly, fingers long, dark bruising on the knuckles. His face was still, the skin slack in that unmistakable way that only the dead possess. But there was no tension, no trace of distress. And yet, I felt uneasy, like I'd walked into a room where someone had just been arguing, and the words still hung in the air. There were no personal effects, no ring, no wallet, no clothing, save for the institutional white sheet pulled to his collarbone. Just a man, laid out and quiet, framed by cold steel. The clerk handed me the chart, thin and creased. Transport by request. No autopsy. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest, but he was comatose the last 4 days. No DNR on file. The attending physician marked expedited transfer. He's been cleared. That's all we have. Her tone was practiced. That kind of apathy you learn not from cruelty, but from proximity. I initialed where needed and slid the transfer sheet into my folder. When I glanced back at the man, Leonard, something caught my eye. A single strand of hair had fallen across his forehead, curling slightly, out of place. I couldn't say why it bothered me. It was such a small thing, meaningless, really. But I reached out and brushed it back behind his ear. His skin wasn't as cold as it should have been. Not warm, certainly, but not icy. More like the chill of a stone that's been sitting in shade. Not lifeless, just long untouched. I covered him, strapped him gently to the gurney, and wheeled him toward the hearse. The clerk disappeared back inside without a word. Outside, the sky hadn't changed. Still that sealed gray, unbroken, unmoving. I opened the rear of the van and slid him in, securing the casket shell around the gurney, locking it in place with a hiss of hydraulic clamps. I've always hated the sound. Too final. I checked everything twice, made sure nothing was loose, nothing would rattle. I always do. It's a ritual, though. Not for the dead. For me, because routine keeps doubt away. As I climbed back into the driver's seat, I glanced again at the transport file. In the back pocket of the folder, a page had come loose, handwritten, barely legible, as if added last minute. It simply read, "Patient exhibited high neural reactivity to sedation. Monitored but non-responsive. Reflex activity noted post-administration. Observation terminated after 48 hours. Transfer approved." No signature, no timestamp, just that faint, smeared ink trailing off at the edge. I frowned, reread it, then folded it and tucked it deeper into the file. I'd seen similar notes before, usually on patients who seized under anesthesia or had trouble waking. It wasn't unusual, not really, but something about the phrasing, "reflex activity noted," lingered in my head. As I pulled onto the road, I adjusted the mirror to check the back. The casket sat motionless, perfectly secured, no movement, no sound. The hum of the van filled the cabin again, and for a moment, it felt almost normal, almost. But then, I realized something. That strand of hair, the one I'd brushed back, it was there again, curling across his forehead, as if it had never been moved. The stretch of road between the county morgue and the cemetery always felt longer than it looked on the map. Maybe it was the way the landscape refused to change, no matter how many miles you put between you and the last building. Trees without character, ditches without depth, telephone poles like clock ticks you couldn't count aloud or you'd lose track of how long you'd been driving. I knew this route well enough to drive it blind. Same faded signs, same potholes nobody bothered to fix, same rusting fence near the grain silo that always rattled in the wind like it was trying to whisper. But today there was no wind, no whisper, not even the steady low moan that usually slipped under the tires like breath through an old house. Just a hush that thickened as the road unspooled. I adjusted the air vents. Nothing, not even the soft whir of climate control. I cracked the window for a second, and the stillness pressed back, not just absence of sound, but the presence of silence. It had weight, texture, like the entire landscape was holding something in. I closed the window again. I'm used to being alone with the dead. It's the job. You learn not to talk to them, not to make it into something it isn't. But sometimes, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror a little more often than needed. Just a flicker of instinct, like my brain trying to confirm that the presence I feel is still just cargo, that it hasn't shifted or changed or returned. I caught myself doing it now, glancing up, holding the gaze too long. The casket was still there, of course, fixed tight, unmoved. But the longer I looked, the more I started to feel like I wasn't looking at it, but that I was being watched from it. A ridiculous thought, unprofessional. I shook it off, turned the radio dial just to break the silence. Static, switched bands. More static. It wasn't a dead zone. I knew that. I'd picked up 3 stations on this route just last week. One gospel, one talk, one some college kid's pirate signal, playing synth and shoegaze at 3 p.m. But now, nothing. Just white noise. I turned it off again. That's when I noticed the hum, or rather, the lack of it. Every hearse I've ever driven has a signature. A baseline drone of engine, road, and internal mechanisms. The clamps, the suspension, the vibration of transport rails. It's like a symphony you stop hearing unless it changes. But the van had gone quiet. Not dead, just paused, as if all the background noise had stepped aside, giving way to something else. Something waiting to be noticed. I glanced down at the odometer, mostly out of habit. 14 miles in. Still early, but my palms were already moist against the steering wheel, like I'd just pulled out of a high-speed chase. My neck itched, not from sweat, but from that static tingle of being observed, not by cameras or people, but by something undefined. The kind of awareness that doesn't come from eyes, but from memory, as if the road remembered me, or worse, remembered him. The man in the back, Leonard Wells. His name felt strange in my mouth, even silently, like it didn't belong to the body I was transporting, like it was a placeholder, and something older had taken up residence in the shell. That wasn't the kind of thing I liked to think on, but the job gives you time, too much of it, and silence like this, complete, clinical pressing, makes the mind turn inward in all the wrong directions. At mile 17, the sky began to shift, not brighter, not darker, just closer. The clouds lowered, like they'd unspooled from heaven, and now hung just a few feet above the windshield. It wasn't fog, and it wasn't rain. The air wasn't wet, but everything looked smudged, as if reality itself had been wiped with an oily rag. Shapes blurred, colors dimmed. Even the lines on the asphalt lost definition. I flicked on the headlights, but they didn't help. They just illuminated more of the haze. And in that grayness, I began to feel it. Not movement, not sound, pressure. Like the van had slipped underwater, and something immense hovered just above the roof. Unseen, unmoving, deliberate. I slowed the vehicle, heart now drumming harder than any engine hum could. My breathing felt too loud. I opened my mouth just to see if sound still worked, and whispered, "Everything's fine." The words vanished, absorbed. No echo in the cab, no bounce from the dash, just swallowed whole by the hush. I glanced back again, not because I heard anything, but because I couldn't stop myself. And that's when I saw it. Not the body, not the casket, but the faintest shimmer along the edge of the lid, a reflection that shouldn't have been there, like breath on lacquer, a residue of something that had moved, or was about to move. My throat tightened. I forced my eyes forward again and kept driving. Another few miles passed, though I couldn't tell you how many. Time had started to lose shape. The sun never changed position. The road remained flat. No cars, no signs, no sound but the tires whispering secrets to the dust. And yet, the sense of pressure never lifted. It just grew more familiar, like someone leaning on your shoulder, until you stopped noticing the weight. And then it happened, so subtle, I almost missed it. The air inside the van shifted, not cooler, not warmer, just disturbed, like a breath had been taken somewhere it shouldn't have been possible. I checked the rear view again. The shimmer was gone, but the feeling remained. That was the first time I thought, maybe he isn't done yet. There are sounds that belong to the living footsteps, breathing, the crack of knuckles, the scratch of fingernails across wood. And then there are sounds that exist in that no man's land between the body and whatever comes after it. Sounds that don't echo right, that don't belong anywhere. What I heard that day on that nowhere stretch of road didn't rattle the windows or make me scream. It was smaller than that. It was careful. One single knock, not a slam, not frantic, just a dry, purposeful tap directly behind my seat, like someone knocking softly to say, "I'm still here." I didn't react right away. My hands kept the wheel straight. My eyes didn't leave the windshield. But inside, something recoiled. Some ancestral cord that hadn't been pulled since childhood suddenly tugged tight. The kind of instinct that tells you to run, even when your legs won't move. It had been silent for so long that the sound felt surgical precise in how it entered the cabin, not through my ears, but directly into the spine. I swallowed, glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing out of place, no movement, no shift in weight. But the knock, it had been real. I slowed down. My heart was beating faster than the engine now, and I could feel the sweat under my collar rising to meet the back of my neck. The van didn't feel like a hearse anymore. It felt like a sealed room, a vessel with me, and it inside. I wanted to speak, to say something like, "That didn't happen," or "It was just the road." But the silence that followed was aggressive, not empty. It was the silence of something waiting for your response. I pulled over slowly onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched beneath the tires, too loud, too sharp against the quiet. I put the van in park and just sat there, hands still on the wheel, breathing through my mouth because my nose felt clogged with the tension. I didn't turn around, Not at first. Instead, I reached slowly to my right and unbuckled. Let the strap coil back like a snake into its resting place. I exhaled, and I opened the driver's side door. The air outside was dense, like walking into a humid room with no ventilation. But it wasn't hot, just heavy. I stepped around to the back of the hearse and paused there, fingers brushing the keys in my pocket. I hesitated, not out of fear of ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts. I fear misjudgments, human error, mistakes in paperwork, the idea that someone thought he was dead, but wasn't. I unlocked the back door and opened it slowly. The casket sat there, exactly as I'd placed it, centered, secure, unmarked, no scratches, no chips. The lid was intact, no signs of pressure or release. I checked the clamps, still tight, still sealed. My hands hovered above it for a second, and in that moment, I wanted nothing more than to knock back, just once, to return the sound, to ask a question without words. But I didn't. Instead, I looked away and checked the interior. No debris, no shifting cargo, nothing loose that might explain the sound. I stepped back, closed the rear door, and stood for a long moment, staring at the reflection of the cloudy sky in the hearse's tinted glass. It looked like the sky itself was watching me, like something behind the clouds had been staring down the whole time. I got back in the driver's seat and closed the door, locked it, not out of habit, out of instinct. I glanced at the file on the passenger seat again. Leonard Wells, age 67, time of death, 3:12 a.m. Tuesday. Cause, cardiac arrest following complications under anesthesia. Notes, patient exhibited strong aversion to sedation, history of anxiety regarding hospitals. There were more scribbles, handwritten ones, barely legible. Tried to remove 4, repeated phrase, I'm not ready. A chill moved through me. Not cold, not supernatural, just the logical horror of someone aware of their own fading and unable to stop it. I placed the file back and wiped my palms on my pants. The engine turned over too easily, like it was trying to pretend nothing had happened. I pulled back onto the road, but the knock stayed with me. Not the sound, but the shape of it, the meaning. One strike, like punctuation. Not a cry for help, but a statement. Something final, or maybe something unfinished. I drove slower now. The road felt unfamiliar, like the tires were gliding over something that wasn't quite real. My hands itched to turn the radio back on, just to hear another voice. But I couldn't. I was afraid the static might say something back. The knock had a rhythm. Not musical, but emotional. Like the last note in a conversation you didn't know you were having. I couldn't stop thinking about the timing. 15 minutes into the drive, just as I had crossed the boundary where the hills begin to level into those long dead plains near Miller's Orchard. I'd passed that place 100 times, but suddenly it felt like a line I shouldn't have crossed, as if Leonard Wells had waited, quietly, for that exact moment to reach out. Not with desperation, but with deliberation. I kept driving, eyes forward, but I knew that if the knock came again, I wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. One is a mistake, a creak, a shift in weight. But two knocks mean intent. 2 knocks mean someone is trying, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I'd like to say I kept calm, that I handled the rest of the drive like a professional. But my hands were clenched so tight around the wheel, I barely noticed how white my knuckles had gone. Every small bump in the road, every groan of the suspension, every passing shadow on the windshield became a suspect. I didn't look back again until the next stop sign. And even then, I kept my gaze shallow, just enough to confirm that the lid was closed, that nothing had moved, that I was still alone. But I knew I wasn't. Not really. Something had changed. The air inside the hearse no longer felt sterile. It felt shared, like I was coexisting with something unsaid. A message half sent, a thought trapped in wood and metal and grief. It wasn't over. I knew it, even if I kept driving, even if I delivered the body, even if I laid him to rest. and never spoke of it again. That knock would live somewhere inside me, waiting for its echo. I didn't see the pothole until the last second. My hands were too tight on the wheel, and my eyes had drifted, not off the road exactly, but inward like I was watching the drive from behind my own skull. The jolt of the tires hitting the crater snapped me back, but not before a low thud from the back reverberated through the metal frame of the hearse. And I thought stupidly, irrationally, that maybe it had been another knock, another message. But no, this was different. This wasn't deliberate. It was loud and messy, like the world reminding me that gravity still mattered. I pulled over again, hard this time. The brakes screamed louder than I expected, skidding against loose gravel as I came to a sharp halt on the shoulder, just past a weathered road sign that said, Will's Farm Market closed. There was no traffic, no people, just me, the road, and that coffin. I sat for a full minute with my fists still clenched, knuckles aching, chest tight, the engine humming like a whisper I didn't want to hear. I was soaked with sweat, and not the kind that cools you, the kind that rises from something deeper, like your body knows it's in danger, even if your mind hasn't caught up. I turned in my seat slowly, not to look in the mirror this time, but to face the back, to really face it. My throat was dry, and I could hear the pulse in my ears like a slow drumbeat. I unlocked the back from the driver's console with a soft click, and I got out without a sound, careful not to let the door slam behind me. The gravel crunched again so loud, impossibly loud. Every sound had weight now. Every motion felt like it was disturbing something that had been waiting in stillness. I walked around to the rear and paused. My hand hovered over the handle, not because I was afraid of seeing something supernatural, but because I was afraid I might find something perfectly ordinary just shifted, just enough to suggest it hadn't been a dream, just enough to confirm what I already knew, but didn't want to admit. That knock had happened, and now there was a second sound. The thud, a jolt, not caused by the road, not entirely, caused by something moving, reacting. I opened the rear door slowly. No sudden moves. The casket sat as it had before, smooth, polished, pristine. But this time, my eyes went straight to the seal. I dropped to a crouch and examined the clasps. Still locked, still closed. No scratches, no pry marks. But dust. Just a faint outline of dust smudged around the edge of the lid, like someone had dragged a finger across the seam. Not in a frantic way, not in panic, just testing, just checking. I didn't want to touch it. My hand hovered there, an inch above the wood. It was warm. Not hot, not alive, but warmer than I expected for a body that had been stored cold for over a day. I told myself it was the sun, the van, the warmth of the engine. But the coffin shouldn't hold heat. Not like this. I pulled back and shut the rear door firmly, not slamming it, but with enough pressure to remind the universe that I was the one outside and whatever was in there wasn't. Back in the driver's seat, I didn't start the engine right away. I stared at the dashboard, the fuel gauge, the clock. 3:08 p.m. I'd only been driving for 27 minutes. It felt like hours. The silence crept in again, but now it wasn't heavy. It was pointed, focused, like something was listening. I adjusted the mirror, caught my own eyes in the reflection. They didn't look like mine. They looked like someone pretending everything was fine, like someone who'd convinced himself of routine, only to realize he was playing a role in someone else's ending. The chart. The damn chart. I snatched it off the passenger seat. Leonard Wells, 67, no known family, died after complications during sedation. There it was again, resistant to anesthesia. History of waking mid-surgery. Previous incidents. Elevated neural response under sedation. I read the sentence 3 times. Each time it felt heavier, more damning. Below it, scribbled in black pen, almost like an afterthought, patient repeated, "I can hear you, I can feel you. Please don't put me under again." I dropped the chart, not carelessly. It slid down between the seat and the console. I left it there. I started the engine and pulled out. The hearse moved slow, deliberate, like it understood the weight of the moment better than I did. My eyes were wide now, tracking every vibration, every creak in the suspension. I didn't want music. I didn't want the sound of the tires. I wanted to hear nothing, because anything would be better than hearing that knock again. But I also knew, deep down, that the silence wouldn't last. Every bump in the road made my stomach twist. Every incline made the engine groan in just the wrong frequency. And still, I didn't turn back, because turning back meant confronting something. It meant opening that box. It meant confirming or denying what my whole body already believed, that he wasn't fully gone, or worse, that he had been alive and wasn't anymore, that the knock had been real, that the sound was a request, a question, or maybe even a goodbye. I didn't know what I feared more, the idea that the medical staff had made a mistake or that they hadn't, and he still came back anyway. The human brain can live for minutes after the heart stops. Consciousness lingers. There are studies, cold and clinical, that show spikes of awareness just before and after death. Maybe Leonard's final act wasn't medical. Maybe it was will. Maybe that knock was the last push from someone who refused to leave quietly, who refused to let his story end sedated, alone, and zipped into a bag. When I reached the turnoff for the main highway, I stopped. Not for traffic, there was none, but because the breath caught in my lungs and didn't leave. My fingers were twitching on the steering wheel. My ears were ringing. I waited for it. I knew it was coming. One more knock. It didn't come. Instead, there was a creak, just a subtle shift in the rear axle, a weight distribution, a change in pressure. Something small, so small, you'd never notice it unless you were listening. And I was. I was listening so hard that the sound became part of me. I didn't check this time. I didn't need to. I just kept driving, because if I stopped again, I might not move forward. And something told me that Leonard Wells wasn't done yet. Not with the road, not with me. I drove without speaking, without adjusting the mirror again, without even wiping the sweat that pooled along the collar of my shirt. The chart was where I'd left it, jammed between the seat and the center console, like it didn't want to be read again, like it knew it had said too much already. But I couldn't help myself. My hand moved on its own, fingers trembling as they fished the edge of the folder free and pulled it onto my lap. The engine murmured beneath me, soft as breath, and for the first time in years, I realized how loud a piece of paper can be when it shakes in your hands. The creases spoke louder than the printed words. The ink felt permanent in a way that reality wasn't. Leonard Wells, age 67, no listed emergency contact. Place of death, Mapleview Hospital, Ward 3C. Cause, complications during post-operative sedation. Estimated time of death, 11:42 p.m. But it wasn't the official notations that caught me. It was the writing scrawled in frantic pen, the kind that looks rushed but intentional, as if someone couldn't let the thought go even after the form was finished. I read the same sentence again. Resistant to anesthesia. History of awareness under sedation. That line stuck like a thorn in my eye, as if each word carried more weight than the next. I imagined a man lying still, staring through closed lids, feeling everything, hearing the beeps, hearing the soft tones of nurses talking like he wasn't there, trapped in the stillness, trapped in silence, alive in the middle of his own ending. Below that, another note, this one underlined, neural reactivity abnormally high, monitored spikes in consciousness, post-induction. Spikes in consciousness, like bursts of light in the dark, like a scream underwater. The chart didn't say he'd died peacefully. It said he'd fought, quietly, alone, that his brain fired one last flare into the void, hoping someone would see it, and no one had. Not then. There was something else now. A short note in red ink, different handwriting, barely visible along the margin. Patient repeated same phrase before coma. Don't bury me. I can still hear you. I read that 5 times. The voice I imagined saying it wasn't panicked. It was calm, pleading, almost apologetic, like someone who wasn't asking for escape, just acknowledgement, just to be heard. I looked at the road again. The white lines blurred into soft bands of light through the windshield. A mist had started to form, not heavy, but enough to warp the edges of everything, enough to make you question the distance of things. I didn't like how the world looked through that veil, like I was driving through the memory of a place instead of the place itself. My fingers traced the edge of the chart, stopping at the bottom, where a signature had been crossed out. I couldn't read the name, but someone had tried to remove it. A thick black marker dragged roughly over the ink, almost angry, like someone didn't want to be connected to what had happened. But ink bleeds, and I could still make out the tail of a W and something that looked like an H. Not enough to know, just enough to feel watched, tracked, tied to something unfinished. The hearse hit a slight bump, and the chart slid halfway off my lap. I caught it just before it fell, but something else slid out with it, a slip of paper I hadn't noticed before, tucked deep inside the back flap, a personal effects form, unsigned. At the bottom, in the notes section, written in the same frantic hand as the warning about awareness, it read, "Patient spoke of sensation of being buried alive in dreams. Said dreams felt more real than waking." That line didn't feel like medicine. It felt like confession, like someone trying to process what they'd heard and didn't know where else to write it, like someone trying to get it out before it got in. My knuckles were pale on the wheel again. I hadn't even noticed the turnoff approaching. The sign for the cemetery stood crooked in the grass, its paint faded and flaking, like it didn't want to be read either. I didn't turn. I didn't signal. I just kept going straight. Not because I had somewhere else to be, but because I couldn't go there. Not yet. Not after reading that. Not with that sound still echoing faintly in the rear of the hearse. That sound of something deliberate. That knock. That warning. Or was it a request? The fog thickened slightly, and my headlights started catching it like webs in the air. I didn't slow down. I didn't speed up. I just drove, as if motion alone could save me from the implications of what I'd read. As if distance could outpace guilt. But the words clung to the inside of the vehicle, heavier than the scent of antiseptic, louder than the soft hum of tires on asphalt. I can still hear you. It wasn't just a sentence anymore. It was a presence. It lived in the space between my breaths, in the silence between each creak of the suspension. It sat in the back seat like an invisible passenger, patient, calm, waiting for me to believe. I wanted to call someone, a nurse, a supervisor, anyone who had signed off on that chart. But I knew the answer already. I knew what they'd say, that everything was followed, that protocols were met. That time of death was certified by 2 separate attendants. But paperwork isn't always truth. It's agreement. It's consensus. A collective shrug at the edge of uncertainty. So I didn't call. I didn't pull over. I just kept driving. But now I wasn't heading toward the cemetery anymore. I wasn't following any map. I was following instinct, compulsion, maybe even fear. I needed someone to tell me, really tell me, that Leonard Wells was dead. Not on paper, not clinically, but truly, spiritually, irrevocably. Because if he wasn't, then what had I been transporting for the last 40 minutes? And if he was, then why did it still feel like he was trying to say something? The chart rested on the passenger seat again. I stared at it every few seconds, as if it might change when I looked away. But it didn't. Those same phrases remained. That same echo of panic. That same plea buried between sterile lines. And suddenly, I realized what truly haunted me. It wasn't the possibility that Leonard Wells had been alive. It was the possibility that his worst fear had come true. That he had lived just long enough to know what was happening. That he had felt the zipper, the movement, the cold, the dark. That knock wasn't terror. It was hope. The last spark of a man who still believed someone might hear. And I had heard him. I just didn't know if it was too late. I didn't speak. I didn't blink much either. My eyes stayed locked on the road, as if it held the only truth left. The silence inside the hearse wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, the kind that settles on your chest and makes every breath feel like a mistake. The paper on the seat beside me had stopped rattling, even though the tires still hummed. It was as if the whole vehicle had joined in a pact not to disturb what was lingering. I remember thinking how strange it was that silence could feel so full of weight, full of pressure, full of the possibility that I hadn't been wrong. The road ahead opened into a long stretch, one of those dead straight highways where the trees thin out and the sky starts swallowing the horizon. That's when the light turned red. Just a single light, suspended over an empty intersection. I rolled to a stop. Not another car in sight, not even a bird. And it was in that moment, just as the hearse settled into stillness again, that it came. The knock. The second knock. Same place, same rhythm. Right behind me, near the partition between the front and the rear compartment. But this one was just a little louder. Not frantic, not panicked. Still calm, still controlled. It wasn't the kind of sound that begged for attention. It was the kind that expected it. Like whoever made it knew they had my full focus now. I didn't move right away. I just sat there, hands locked on the wheel, eyes forward, pretending the light needed me more than the coffin did. But then came the breath. I swear to you, there was breath. Not mine, not the hum of the engine. No vents were open. The windows were sealed. And yet, just behind my right shoulder, I felt it, heard it. That faint shift in air, followed by a subtle fog creeping into the corner of the mirror. A soft crusade of mist, like someone had breathed on the glass from the inside. I turned my head slowly, like something ancient was pulling at my neck. The mirror showed nothing but the polished wood of the casket behind me. Closed, sealed, still, but the breathmark remained, hanging there like a signature. I reached up, wiped it with the back of my sleeve. The condensation vanished immediately, but the feeling didn't. It had pressed itself into me, into the cabin, into the rhythm of my thoughts. I didn't check the back this time. I didn't pull over. I didn't want to see the lid. I didn't want to stand there again, with my hand hovering over it, like some priest about the blessed door he's too afraid to open. I just needed to know. And so, with the light still red, with no one in sight, I reached across and picked up the file again, not to read it. I already knew every line. I needed to feel its weight, to remind myself that this was real, that I wasn't dreaming, that there was a body back there, and a file that said he was dead, official, certified. But paperwork doesn't knock. Paperwork doesn't breathe. I accelerated when the light turned green. Not fast, but faster than I should have in a hearse. There was no urgency from the outside world, only from inside the car. I kept looking back at the mirror, hoping to catch something I could dismiss. A trick of light, a curtain of dust. But it was always just the casket, still and unmoved, like a perfect lie. The strange thing is, I started listening harder, as if a part of me needed the sound again, like validation, proof that I hadn't lost my mind, that this wasn't grief or guilt or some dark echo of too many years, ferrying the forgotten from cold slabs to colder soil. I found myself holding my breath at each stop sign, waiting, daring the silence to repeat itself. That's how deep it had burrowed into me. That knock had become more real than the rest of the world. Somewhere between county line markers and the bend near Birch Hollow, I noticed the music was off. I always drove with something playing instrumental, mostly slow and respectful, part habit, part ritual. But the silence had returned to that earlier density, and I didn't even remember turning the volume down. I reached for the dial, fingertips brushing plastic, and paused. There it was again. That breath, not a gasp, not even a sigh, just presence. Like someone trying to be discreet, but failing. That's when the question finally hit me. What if he hadn't died in the hospital? What if the chart was wrong? What if the sedation had worked just enough to make them think he was gone, but his mind stayed awake, buried behind the paralysis, screaming in silence? The file said he was resistant. It said he was reactive. Maybe that breath I heard wasn't new. Maybe it had been building all this time. Held in, repressed, locked in muscle memory until the coffin moved. My stomach turned, but I didn't feel sick. I felt aware, like my senses had sharpened, like the world had narrowed down to the frame of the hearse, and every inch of it held some potential message. I opened the glove box without thinking, searching for what I don't know. A flashlight? A rosary? Something to remind me of control. But there was nothing in there except an old inspection tag and a faded pack of mints. I closed it slowly. The knock didn't come again. Not yet. But I knew it would. Not because I believed in ghosts. Not because I had some deep spiritual revelation. But because the pattern was clear now. The knocks weren't random. They were reminders. A heartbeat trying to maintain rhythm. That's when I saw the sign for the cemetery coming up again. Faded metal, crooked post. I slowed, turned my signal on, and then turned it off. I didn't take the turn. Something inside me screamed not to, because I was starting to believe the knock wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. I didn't need directions to the hospital. The route was burned into my muscle memory from 100 other pickups, though those trips were always in the other direction out, not back. But this time, my hands turned the wheel as if possessed by a decision that had already been made deep inside me, before I had even admitted it to myself. I wasn't going to the cemetery. I didn't care what the schedule said or how long the plot had been reserved. I needed to see the place where he had died or hadn't. I needed someone else to confirm it. To confirm, I hadn't imagined the knocks, the breath, the chill in the air that hadn't left the cabin since I first heard that soft tap behind me. The hearse hummed against the worn asphalt, the tires tracing a path that felt less like escape and more like confrontation. The dashboard clock ticked slowly, minutes dragging into themselves, each second feeling as if it might bring a new sound from the casket behind me. But none came. Not a knock, not a sigh. Only the memory of them, lodged behind my ears, like something just barely out of hearing range. The hospital stood on a hill, squat and square, like a monument to bureaucracy. I knew the back entrance, the one they never show to visitors. I parked near the loading dock, with a dead enter without ceremony, where I'd picked up dozens, maybe hundreds of bodies over the years, but never had I brought one back, especially not like this. I killed the engine and listened. Nothing. That silence again, pressing in from all sides, like invisible cloth wrapped around my skull. I stepped out slowly, half expecting the coffin lid to be ajar, or some crack in the wood revealing eyes beneath. But it was shut, smooth, elegant, undisturbed. It mocked me now, its perfection, its stillness. I left the rear hatch closed and walked toward the A entrance, the file clutched in my hand like a passport into the truth. Inside, the fluorescent lighting made everything feel sterile and unreal. A woman in scrubs sat behind the desk, chewing the end of a pen cap. She didn't look up at first. I cleared my throat. When she did, her expression shifted from boredom to mild confusion, and then to concern. I told her the name. Her brow furrowed. She didn't need to check the computer. She remembered him, not because of anything medical, but because of the way he'd spoken before he went under. She leaned in, voice low, as if the walls themselves were listening. He kept saying something, she said, over and over. Wouldn't stop until the anesthesia finally took. I asked her what it was. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the doors like she might get in trouble for even repeating it. Then she whispered, "Don't bury me. I can still hear you." I stood there, not moving. Every hair on my arms stood on end. She continued. It creeped a few of us out. You know how some patients mumble weird things when they're going under? But he just kept repeating it. Calm, but urgent. Over and over. She tapped her fingers on the desk, nervous. They checked everything. Monitors, brain activity, heart rate, all flat. He was gone. At least, that's what they told us. Her voice trailed off, and she looked toward the glass doors behind me, toward the hearse parked at the edge of the lot. "You brought him back?" she asked, like the question itself felt wrong. I nodded. I didn't tell her why. Didn't tell her about the knocks, or the breath, or how the dashboard mirror had started to fog without cause. I didn't have to. I think part of her already knew. I asked if I could see the doctor who signed off on the death certificate. She said he wasn't in today. Of course not, but she offered to print another copy of the file. I declined. I didn't need more paper. What I needed couldn't be found in ink and stapled charts. I needed certainty, and there wasn't a shred of it left in my hands. I left the E without saying much else. The automatic doors whished closed behind me, sealing the cold back inside. The air outside felt heavier now, not just because of the overcast sky, but because of what I'd learned, or rather what had been confirmed. He'd been conscious, or at least aware, somehow. The voice in my head started whispering that same sentence over and over, matching the rhythm of the knocks. "Don't bury me. I can still hear you." I walked back to the hearse slowly, half expecting the windows to be fogged again, but they were clear. The vehicle looked normal, clean, professional, like the knock had never happened, like the breath hadn't painted a faint crescent on the glass. But I knew better. I opened the driver's door and slid in, avoiding even a glance at the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see his face not real or imagined. I started the engine. It turned over smoothly, as if the car itself was indifferent to what I now knew. And I drove, not to the cemetery, not yet. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe nowhere, maybe anywhere, but back to that hole in the ground. All I knew was that I couldn't deliver that coffin. Not now. Not after hearing that sentence. Not after realizing he may have never stopped hearing us. The highway blurred past. Trees bent toward the road like they were watching. I turned off the radio again. Not that I'd played it since the second knock, but I didn't want even the possibility of distraction. I needed to hear everything now. Every creak, every shift in air pressure, every memory replayed in the shape of a sound. I rolled the window down slightly just to feel something real. The air was cold, honest. It cut through me and settled into my bones like a second skin. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The voice in my head had taken over. Every few miles, I found myself tapping the steering wheel in that same rhythm. Subconsciously, 3 soft taps, like knocking on wood to ward off something you don't understand. And the mirror, though I didn't want to look, I caught glimpses. The casket remained closed, always closed, but in some strange way, it felt less like it was holding someone in, and more like it was keeping something out, or perhaps preserving the echo of what was left behind. I don't know. I just know I kept driving, and behind me, in the endless hush between thoughts, I still expected it. One more knock, just one more. I didn't intend to return, not after what she told me. Not after hearing those words, "Don't bury me." I can still hear you echo from a nurse's lips, like they belonged to someone else, someone still alive. I drove without direction, looping through the old industrial side of town, where every building looked either abandoned or pretending not to be. My eyes stung from lack of sleep, my stomach a hollow weight, but I couldn't go home, and I couldn't go to the cemetery. I ended up pulling into the hospital's rear lot again, a silent passenger to my own indecision. The hearse idled while I sat behind the wheel, staring at the casket in the rearview mirror, the wood polished and sealed like nothing had ever happened inside it. But I knew. I heard him. I felt the knock in my bones, like an aftershock beneath the skin. I stared so long at that mirror, I thought I saw movement again, a ripple of shadow just behind the headrest, like someone had sat up, then laid down again. I blinked, and it was gone. Or maybe it was never there. Still, I turned off the ignition and went back inside. This time, the nurse behind the counter wasn't the one from before. Younger, distracted. I gave her the same name, but she didn't react. Just tapped on her keyboard and nodded, eyes never leaving the screen. He was declared Doe 3 nights ago. Records are complete. Anything else? I asked if the previous nurse was still on shift. She checked. Sharon's still here. Want me to page her? I nodded. Minutes later, Sharon came through the double doors with a hesitance that told me she knew I wasn't done with this. Her face was pale in the fluorescent light, but her eyes carried something deeper than fear recognition. Like she'd expected I'd come back. Maybe people like me always do. I asked her to tell me again everything she remembered. We stepped aside, near a bank of vending machines where no one seemed to care what was said. She spoke quietly. He was brought in after collapsing at home. No ID, just a wallet with cash and a handwritten card that said no heroic measures. He was conscious when they rolled him in. Eyes wide, pulse erratic, but his voice was steady. Just one phrase over and over. He didn't scream it. He didn't cry. He said it like he was giving instructions to people already gone. She looked at me now, her fingers twisting together. We sedated him once he started seizing. He flatlined less than 20 minutes later. I asked her if she believed he was gone when they declared him. She didn't answer immediately, just leaned against the wall like she needed it to stay upright. It's not my call, she finally said. But sometimes they go quiet before the machines agree with them. Sometimes the body is still catching up. She looked me in the eye. Sometimes I think they're still there, trapped behind the silence. I asked to see the room. She hesitated, then led me upstairs through a service elevator that reeked of bleach and rust. The hallway was dim, half the lights out to conserve power during night shift. The room 407 was empty now, stripped. A bed, a chair, a dry erase board still had his name scrawled faintly in red, L. Darnell. Nothing more. Sharon stood in the doorway while I walked in alone. I stood at the foot of the bed, trying to imagine him lying there, voice strained from dehydration, whispering, "Don't bury me," to people who barely had time to listen. I sat in the chair, closed my eyes, tried to listen. Nothing came. No knocks, no breath, no whispered messages. Just the hum of the overhead light and the slight buzz of a loose vent in the wall. But still, I stayed. 10 minutes, maybe 20. Then I stood and left. Outside the room, Sharon was gone. I took the elevator alone, walked the corridor alone, exited back into the night with that strange, hushed quiet that hospitals always seem to keep, even in the open air. The hearse sat beneath the same light, the casket unchanged. But as I opened the door and slid back in, something had shifted again. I noticed it when I adjusted the mirror. The condensation was back. Just a trace. Just enough to leave a foggy crescent on the lower right corner of the glass. And below it, 3 faint lines, parallel, as if someone inside had reached up and drawn fingertips through the mist. I stared for a long time, then wiped it away. I started the engine. I had nowhere left to go, except the cemetery. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. Every part of me wanted to make a different choice to turn around, to drive until I ran out of road, to bury the hearse and the casket and the memory beneath layers of time and denial. But the route was already written. The cemetery waited like a final period at the end of a sentence I hadn't agreed to finish. The road curved gently as I pulled out, and in the quiet, I heard it again. Not loud, not frantic, just one knock, behind me, like punctuation. But this time, I didn't stop. I didn't take the shortest road. I couldn't. I knew the way to the cemetery, like the lines on my own hand, every turn and stretch, mapped by routine and repetition. But that night, I drove as if I were dragging time behind me. I took side streets, gravel roads, passed through neighborhoods I hadn't seen since I was young enough to be afraid of the dark for simpler reasons. The hearse hummed beneath me, a low and constant vibration like something breathing between the metal. The weight in the back felt different now, not heavier in the literal sense, but aware. I can't explain it properly. It's like when you sense someone staring from behind a curtain. You don't see them, but your body adjusts itself to their presence anyway. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror without meaning to, not checking traffic, not even really checking the casket, just waiting, hoping, or maybe dreading. There's a space between those two things that most people never have to live in. But I did, mile after mile, in the hollow silence of that long drive. I didn't play music. I didn't speak aloud, though part of me wanted to say something to acknowledge him, maybe. Apologize. But I didn't know if it would help or make things worse. And still, the memory of that knock clean, intentional, from inside, never left my ears. It lived there now, permanently. I passed an old service station, long closed, its signage missing letters, and its windows sealed with plywood. The kind of place that looked abandoned even when it was open. I remembered passing it once on another funeral drive years ago. A quiet military burial. No family there either. That time, the only sound was a flag rustling in the wind. This time, the world felt like it was holding its breath. And still I drove. Another left, another right. An overpass where the highway dipped and lost all radio signal. And somewhere in that curve, I swear I heard it again. Not a knock this time, but a scrape, gentle, like fingers dragging lightly along the wood from inside. I clenched the wheel tighter, knuckles going white. My heart didn't race somehow. That was worse. It just froze. Like it too was waiting. The cemetery finally came into view, its iron gate half open like a crook's smile in the dark. No lights inside. The only illumination came from my own headlights, cutting a narrow path between the rows. The groundskeeper knew I'd be late. He always left the side gate unlocked for me when I was running behind. I rolled slowly through, gravel crunching under the tires, the crunches too rhythmic, too loud in the quiet. I parked near the delivery platform, killed the engine, and just sat there for a while. No sound, no movement. But I didn't get out immediately. Something about the air felt thicker now, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own blood pumping. Then, behind me, one knock. Just one. The same tone, same place, my spine locked. I didn't move, not even a breath. It was so soft, and yet it split the silence open like a seam. I turned slowly, hands trembling. My eyes met the mirror. Nothing, but I didn't trust that anymore. I reached back, opened the driver's door, stepped out. The night air was colder than I expected. Damp, too. The ground beneath me was uneven, the stones jutting out from the soil like broken teeth. I walked around to the rear of the hearse and unlocked the back doors. They opened with a creak louder than I remembered, the hinges protesting the night. The casket sat still, undisturbed. But again, I felt its presence, like something in there was waiting for me to make the next move. I stared for what must have been a full minute before I reached forward and placed a hand on the wood. It was warm, not room temperature, warm. My breath caught. I pulled my hand back, closed the doors, locked them. I didn't open the casket. I couldn't. I wouldn't. Instead, I unloaded it to the transfer dolly and rolled it into the holding chamber, leaving the paperwork on the clipboard like always. Nothing out of protocol. Nothing to raise questions. Just another delivery, clean and on time. But when I walked out, something made me turn. There was a window in the chamber door, small, wire-mached glass. I looked through it one last time. I thought I saw a shadow shift, just a flicker, a blur behind the casket. But I didn't linger. I walked back to the hearse, got in, turned the ignition, and as I pulled away from the gate, the cemetery fading behind me, I whispered, "You're home now." I don't know why. I don't believe in ghosts. I've never been superstitious. But something about that night changed the way I look at death, not as a line, but as a door. And sometimes, the knock comes before the door's meant to open. Sometimes, we're too eager to close it. I took the long road home again. No music, no distractions. Just me, the hum of the engine, and the whispering silence that always follows these kinds of nights. And somewhere between the miles, where the asphalt split open under my headlights, and the trees pressed in like quiet witnesses. I heard it, one last time. Just a single knock, soft, behind me. Then nothing. And I've never driven in silence since.